It started with a sentence that nobody expected. Not from him. Not after all these years. The cameras were already rolling. The studio lights were bright. The interviewer leaned forward slightly, expecting a typical celebrity story. Maybe something about Hollywood, maybe something about music. But instead, Terrence Howard smiled quietly for a moment and said something that instantly froze the room. He said that years ago, he had the chance to date Beyonce. And not just any time in her life. He meant during the early days. Back when she was still performing with Destiny's Child. For a second, the interviewer thought he had misheard him. But Howard repeated it calmly, almost casually, like he was remembering something ordinary. Moment. Conversation. A possibility that almost happened. And suddenly, millions of fans across the internet were asking the same question. What exactly happened between Terrence Howard and Beyonce? Because if you think about it, the timing makes this story even more fascinating. Back in the late 1990s and early 2000s, Beyonce was already becoming one of the most recognizable voices in music. Destiny's Child was dominating radio stations across America. Songs like Say My Name and Bills, Bills, Bills were everywhere. Meanwhile, Terrence Howard was quietly building a reputation in Hollywood as a serious actor. His career was rising fast, but he hadn't yet reached the global fame he would later achieve. Their worlds, music and film, were beginning to overlap. And somewhere inside that overlap, their paths crossed. But according to Howard, what happened next surprised even him. Because sometimes in life, a single decision can quietly change the direction of everything. A single yes, or a single no. And in this case, one choice may have altered a story that could have been very different. But to understand that moment, you have to go back. Back to a time before Beyonce became one of the most powerful entertainers on the planet. Back to Houston. Back to a group of young singers chasing a dream. Long before stadium tours and global superstardom, Beyonce was simply a teenager from Houston with an extraordinary voice. Music was already a huge part of her life. Her father managed the group that would eventually become Destiny's Child, and their journey was anything but easy. Early rehearsals were intense. Performances happened anywhere they could get stage time. Shopping malls, small events, local showcases. They were talented, but talent alone rarely guarantees success. What Destiny's Child had, though, was something else. Relentless determination. The group slowly began attracting attention from record executives. Soon they were signed, and their debut album introduced the world to a new sound. But their real breakthrough came later. By the late 1990s, Destiny's Child was becoming unstoppable. Every new single climbed the charts. Every performance brought new fans. Every interview revealed a young singer named Beyonce who possessed not only vocal power but natural star presence. She wasn't just performing songs. She commanded attention. And that attention soon spread beyond the music industry. Hollywood began noticing. Film producers noticed. Actors noticed. Including a young actor trying to build his own career. The same time Destiny's Child was climbing the charts, Terrence Howard was navigating the complicated world of Hollywood. His early career wasn't easy. Hollywood can be unpredictable, and even talented actors often struggle for years before finding their breakthrough. Howard took smaller roles, supporting parts, independent films. Each project slowly built his reputation as someone who brought intensity and emotional depth to every character he played. Directors noticed something unique about him. He had presence. Not the flashy kind. Quiet kind. The kind that makes audiences lean forward slightly when he appears on screen. Still, fame hadn't arrived yet. He was respected, but he wasn't a household name. Not yet. Which makes the story he told years later even more interesting. Because according to Howard, sometime during this period, he met Beyonce. And the circumstances surrounding that meeting were far from ordinary. The exact details have never been fully confirmed. Howard himself only described it briefly during interviews. But according to his story, their paths crossed during the early 2000s. Beyonce was already becoming one of the most talked about young artists in music. Destiny's Child was dominating charts worldwide. Meanwhile, Hollywood events were beginning to invite major musicians and rising actors into the same spaces. Award shows, industry parties, private gatherings, places where artists from completely different industries suddenly found themselves in the same room. One of those rooms, apparently, was where Terrence Howard met Beyoncé. He later described her as kind, respectful, focused, not at all like the larger-than-life superstar many people would later imagine. At the time, she was simply a young woman with extraordinary talent and an incredibly busy schedule. But Howard admitted something interesting. He said that during their conversation, there seemed to be genuine chemistry, not the dramatic movie-style kind, just the quiet recognition between two people who respected each other, and for a moment, seemed like something might actually happen. But then something unexpected changed the situation completely. Howard later explained that he ultimately chose not to pursue the relationship. Not because of a problem, not because of conflict, but because he believed the timing wasn't right. In his own words, he felt that Beyoncé was too young at that moment, and he wanted to respect that. Looking back years later, he described the situation with a mixture of amusement and curiosity. Because when you consider who Beyoncé would eventually become, the idea of almost dating her during the Destiny's Child era feels like a strange piece of alternate history. Think about it. At the time, she was still in the early stages of a career that would eventually redefine modern pop music. Within just a few years, Beyoncé would launch a solo career that exploded worldwide. Albums, tours, awards, global influence. She would eventually become one of the most powerful figures in entertainment. But in that earlier moment, none of that was guaranteed yet. She was simply a young artist standing at the edge of something enormous. And according to Terrence Howard, he happened to cross paths with her right before that explosion happened. But here's where the story becomes even more interesting. Because once Howard shared that memory publicly, the internet reacted immediately. Fans had questions. Journalists started digging through old timelines. And people began wondering what the entertainment world might look like if things had unfolded differently. 'Cause sometimes, the most fascinating stories in Hollywood aren't the relationships that happened. They're the ones that almost did. And what happened next after Howard revealed that story sparked a completely new wave of discussion online.